Hey everybody, it is June 2021, and as always, there is just one more public forum tournament on the calendar for this academic year. And that is, of course, NSDA Nationals. So if you've made it, if you've qualified, congratulations. If you're just here to learn a little bit more about public forum debate in general, like in the off season to get ready for next year, that's tremendous too. So congratulations on that. Regardless, we've got a lot to cover in this video, and we've got a really cool topic. So let's jump right in and start talking about the NSDA Nationals PF resolution resolved in the United States. Social media is beneficial for democratic values, which I think is a pretty cool resolution. As always, we want this to be useful to you. So if it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. As always, we will have all of the sources we cite as well as the timestamps in the notes below, so you can check those out if you find them useful. So I want to jump right in and start talking about some initial thoughts on the resolution and also some initial thoughts on how NSDA Nationals works, because I think it's really important to understand how this very unique tournament operates if you've never been before. So we'll start with that, and then we'll talk about the substance of the topic. So right off, how NSDA Nationals works. Well, if you've never been before, which most people statistically haven't, you need to understand how this is different from other big national tournaments, right? So first of all, the judging pool is incredibly diverse. It's going to have more lay people, more parents judging, more non-technical judges than at a typical big national circuit type tournament. And I personally think this is a good thing, as it forces teams into a more balanced style of debating. You can still use all your great evidence. You can still use most of your really cool tactics. You just have to adapt them to folks who want to hear more of a clear narrative story, who want to hear good oratorical delivery. Watch the finals, watch the videos of the late out rounds, which you can find, out there on the internet. This is what the winning teams are doing. If you go in and you speed read a bunch of technical sounding stuff, you can still win some rounds with some judges, but you dramatically lower your odds of getting that key swing ballot from a non-technical judge. And in a tournament that goes 15 to 16 rounds, you absolutely have to play the odds and get a little bit lucky to win, right? So as a practical matter, what does this mean? What does it mean for how you approach the actual rounds in your preparation? Well, a few things. First of all, you're going to want to make sure you keep your delivery at a moderate pace. Say more with fewer words. If you have like a long paragraph block quote, read the 2 sentences that matter, have the rest available in your notes if needed, but editing and cutting out the fat is your friend. Also, practice your delivery in front of non-experts. Practice reading your case in front of your parents, friends who are not debaters. Make sure they feel like it sounds like a good, solid, clear speech, because you're going to have judges who are looking at that, right? Make sure your case and ideally your blocks and rebuttals tell a pretty clear story, right? So don't go in and say, point 1 is resisting injustice, and then just start reading this really dense card at a high speed. Instead, say, our first contention is that social media has been instrumental in documenting and opposing serious injustices. Dr. Sandra Smith in 2020 explained, right? And then explain, what the card actually says, right? In your rebuttals, you need to be covering the flow, but you also need to be making time to come back to the big picture, right? We're going to talk later about how this really is a big picture topic where you have to really think about what democratic values are. But suffice it to say that at NSDA, and on this topic in particular and in general, it is necessary to bring judges back to the big picture of explaining how they should frame and weigh the resolution, as opposed to just going point by point by point, machine gun down the flow, right? That's important. And the last thing is, in rounds with sort of more non-technical judges, it's even more important to remember not to be a jerk, right? And I think if you watch this channel, that, we're vehemently opposed to people who are abusive and belligerent in rounds. And I think that judges really want to try to give the round to the more likable side if they can possibly justify it on the substance. That's even more true with your parent judges, even more true with folks who aren't acclimated to the rough and tumble of some circuits of debate, right? So no matter what, be the side that's keeping their cool, not getting baited into snippy little fights. Again, if you watch the finals and the laid out rounds that you can find out there, you're going to see how there are great teams with great substantive arguments adapting their style to the audience and still being very smart and analytical. So do that. Turning to the substance of the topic, I think it's a fantastic topic. Maybe the best Nationals PF topic I've seen since I started coaching. And I think that's partly, ironically, because NSDA has given us an LD topic for PF Nationals. And I actually think that's kind of a good thing, right? And what I mean specifically is that the question of exactly what democratic values are is really key here, right? This is very much a Lincoln Douglas style definition framing question that gets into fundamental philosophical issues about exactly what a democracy is supposed supposed to be and what it's supposed to do, right? The political discourse in this country illustrates that people, politicians, authors, they all have very different views about what democracy is at its core. And how you perceive social media's impact hinges not entirely, but to a very large extent on how you answer that question, right? So, for example, if you think that democratic values are just about like wide open discourse, well, that's a huge advantage for the pro. If it's just about throwing it wide open and having a wide open debate, because social media clearly facilitates that, that's going to be an advantage for the pro, right? If democratic values are about things like mutual respect and compromise, or about respecting like shared fact-based realities and truths, well, that's a big advantage for the con, right? And so to me, it is essential that every team, one way or another, spend time articulating and defending with sources and logic what democratic values are. In other words, you're going to be making moral, ethical, and philosophical arguments about what a democracy is supposed to be and what it's supposed to do. Because if you don't do that, right, if you just completely ignore it, right, and you go straight, you do the public forum default, right, of you go straight for the biggest impact you can find, right, social media worsens climate change or something like that, you're going to fall victim to a very simple stock rebuttal, which is they didn't link to democratic values, right? The resolution told you exactly how you're supposed to weigh the round, Judge. You're supposed to look at how it impacts democratic values, and they didn't link to it, so you can just ignore their argument, right? So I'm really excited to see how public forum teams are going to adapt to the need to be a bit more philosophical and to spend time making more value-based arguments. I think it's going to be a really cool balanced resolution and a challenging one, which is what it should be, right? It's NSDA Nationals, right? And then third and finally, the other thing I'll say about the topic is it is a topic where everybody knows a fair bit about it and has opinions on it, and that's going to affect how you prepare and how you argue, right? This is not West Africa or predictive policing or something else where the judges are coming in probably in most cases fairly cold with not a lot of ideas about what is happening. This is social media, right? Where everybody knows the basics, right? Everybody uses social media, or almost everybody. And the vast majority of judges are going to have pre-developed opinions on whether it's good or bad, and they'll have thoughts on how it affects democracy and so on, right? So we just lived through one of the great democratic crises in our country's history with the Republican attempt to overturn a democratic election based on, frankly, a lie, right? And the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, and arguments about how this was all facilitated by social media. Everybody knows what happened, right? Everybody has an opinion one way or the other. Everybody has thoughts on whether Twitter or Facebook is having a good or bad effect on the country, right? Banning controversial figures like President Trump. Everybody's got an opinion on that, right? And more specifically, if somebody is downplaying some aspect of social media in the round, like if your opponent, right? If they're downplaying like the toxicity of certain social media environments or something, you can use personal experience there, right? You can plausibly say, I'm sorry, but have you actually seen the comments made under President Trump's tweets? Have you actually looked at what your grandparents are posting on Facebook in the election, right? Obviously, anecdotes aren't the focus. Reliable evidence still is, and there's a ton of it, right? There's number one, commentary, just sort of opinion pieces by experts, and two, there's a lot of empirical evidence, right? So you really have three sources. You have, the personal experience can be in there a little, but mainly commentary from experts and empirical evidence. You have tons of it, so there's a really, really good balance. But unlike topics like West Africa and predictive policing, personal experience, lived experience is going to factor in with the empirical evidence and with the commentary. And it's going to be, I think, a really interesting balance of here is what this really exhaustive study found versus in some cases, yeah, but have you actually seen social media? Do you know how it works? And I think that's going to be a lot of fun. Luckily, there is an excellent example of how to engage in this sort of real world debate in front of real people. The group Intelligence Squared actually staged a debate in 2018 on more or less this exact topic, featuring experts on both sides, and their audience is just normal educated people who are probably going to be similar to some of the judges you have. So we're obviously going to link to that. I'd highly recommend you watch the whole thing and take notes. Don't just listen to the substantive arguments, although those are good. Also listen to the way these folks talk about the issues. How do they phrase things? What are their money quotes? What are their zingers, their mic drops, things like that? How do they distill this complex topic down to its essence and sell it to people rhetorically? Frankly, I would say feel free not to steal, but to adapt adapt or paraphrase their best lines. But at the end of the day, I think the key on this topic is going to be strong data and evidence. There's a ton of it, and we're obviously going to spend a lot of time on it. Plus real talk. Like, let's talk, hey fam, let's talk for real here. I don't know if the kids still say fam, but you know what I mean. Like, let's talk for real about what this is, right? And that's going to be that combination of empirics and data and just sort of real world talk is going to be the key to victory on this resolution. So that's a lot in terms of the intro. I think it was necessary. So let's jump right in, start with some framing and definitions, which is going to include a key discussion of like what democratic values are and how you defend different theories. Number 2, we'll move on to the pro. Number 3, the con arguments. And then finally, we'll do some final thoughts. Okay, so let's talk about framing the resolution and definitions, right? Now, as usual, I don't expect a ton of framing or topicality fights because they're just less common in public forum. You don't see people reading a ton of definitions in the vast majority of circuits, and also because a lot of the terms in this resolution are fairly straightforward. But there is one huge exception, of course, that we already talked about, and that is the term democratic values, which is such a broad concept that it really goes beyond just having like a dictionary definition ready in your blocks in case you need it. And it really gets into a situation where you have to spend significant time in your case strategically framing what democratic values are and defending that framing, right? And because this is going to be by far the most contentious and important part, we're going to look at the other terms first, and then we're going to come to democratic values last. Fair warning, we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about democratic values. Honestly, probably not as much as we need to. We could probably do a whole video on it, but we're going to spend a fair amount because it's really necessary to understand how to defend these arguments and how they're likely to play out against good teams, okay? So let's start with some of maybe the less contentious terms. First, in the United States. Now, strategically, the limitation of the resolution to the U.S. arguably benefits the con, as it's going to render non-topical examples of places where social media was or is a means of circumventing tight state control on discussion, right, on free speech, right, like China, Egypt, Zimbabwe, and other places. This is one of your strongest arguments by the pro. If you can use it, you really can't use it unless you're very creative, I think, on this. Because, while social media does make discussion easier in the U.S., it was never the sole means for dissenters or opponents to have their opposition to the regime heard, right? Now, are there any ambiguities worth talking about here? Maybe, just briefly. So the term in the United States in most resolutions has a pretty clear meaning because, in the real world, the physical world, events and phenomena and laws clearly happen in and affect a specific country. Here, because it's social media, it's a little more vague because social media doesn't have many obvious national boundaries. So it's not immediately clear whether the term in the United States refers to, like, number 1, where the content on social media originates from, number 2, where the social media content is consumed, or number 3, like whatever point it has an impact regardless of where it comes from or where it's consumed, right? Frankly, I don't think you're going to see a ton of disagreement on this because it's pretty marginal. Like, most of the big impacts on American democracy meet all 3 of these different definitions, right? So, Trump tweets in the US and it impacts politics in the US. The George Floyd video gets uploaded in the US and it impacts, political discourse in the US. Your grandmother posts misleading political information here. It has an impact here. Her friends share it here, right? If you want to get technical about it, my read of the resolution would be that by setting the words in the US apart as a prefatory phrase, it seems to imply that we're really just looking at where the impact happens. So the only reason this really might matter is because I think it does mean that social media efforts done in other countries that impact the United States clearly are topical, right? So things like Russian misinformation efforts, troll farms, right, in the 2016 and 2020 elections, I think they are clearly topical, right? Because the stories and memes they create get shared and circulated by people in the United States, and the impact they have, the harm on elections and things like that, happens in the United States. You could have fights on this, but I think at the end of the day, social media that originates in another country and comes to the US is pretty clearly topical because the impact happens here. That's my reading of the structure of the resolution. The next term is social media. Here again, there are a few nuances in terms of what is topical. I don't see it having a huge impact on most rounds because the bulk of social media that impacts politics comes mainly from platforms that we would all acknowledge clearly meet the definition of social media, right? Like Twitter and Facebook, maybe a little bit on Instagram, Snapchat. YouTube may be a little closer to the line, but most experts are going to say that YouTube is a form of social media. But just to briefly lay out the question that I guess could get asked, where exactly is the line line between like social media on the one hand and the rest of the internet, like just websites, right? Well, we obviously know certain things that absolutely are social media, like Facebook and Twitter, but it's such a broad and ubiquitous term that it is kind of hard to identify exactly where the boundaries lie, right? Where does a technology stop being social media and become something else, like a content provider or a communication tool, like say GroupMe or something, right? The only reason this might matter is if you have, say, a con opponent who wants to talk about, like, for example, message boards on some hate website or some fringe dark web resource for like violent extremists, and you'd want to be able to say, no, that's not really what social media is. You would need some kind of definition in your back pocket. Not going to read it in the case, of course, that takes too much time, but in your blocks for like responses based on topicality, right? So, Webster has a pretty reasonable and, definition that's consistent with popular usage. It just says, forms of electronic communication such as websites for social networking and microblogging through which users create online communities to share information, ideas, messages, and content. Fair enough. I think that's, a pretty solid definition. There are others that are probably too like over-inclusive, right? So you could certainly see people making an argument like Cambridge. This definition from Cambridge is way over-inclusive. It says websites and computer programs that allow people to communicate and share information on the internet using a computer or cell phone. I mean, honestly, that sounds like, I hate to say this, like my grandmother wrote that, right? Because that's like literally everything on the internet. Like literally everything on the internet lets you share information using the internet. So that would be way, way over-inclusive. I think when most people talk about social media, right, they're referring to a site or an app or another online platform that lets an individual engage relatively easily with more or less like reciprocal back and forth sharing of information with a relatively broad group of individuals on the same site or app, right? So it's not just one-way communication, right? It's not just like me setting up a website and you have no mechanism for feedback. And it's also not directed communication with a specific individual, like me texting you or even a GroupMe, right? Or just email, right? So there's a pretty good definition if you want to have it for topicality purposes just in your back pocket from Investopedia. As you can see here, social media is a computer-based technology that facilitates sharing of ideas, thoughts, and information through the building of virtual networks and communities. By design, social media is internet-based and gives users quick electronic communication of content. Content includes personal information, documents, videos, and photos. Users engage with social media via computer, tablet, or smartphone, right? Because this talks about virtual networks and communities, that really emphasizes that you build like a base of followers, you follow other people, you share information back and forth. You have a community, right? Not a one-way megaphone. And I think that's probably a pretty solid definition just to have in your back pocket if you need one. The next term is, and we're actually going to spend just a second on this, even though it's a fairly straightforward term. The first reason why you might consider the word is because of time frame. Is a present tense verb, so one interpretation of using it in the resolution is that the round should focus exclusively or mainly on the interplay of social media and democratic values like in 2021, or at least in the very recent past, right? So for example, examples about like the lack of content moderation on Facebook and Twitter in the early 2010s, you could argue would be irrelevant because the word is means that this is, we only look at what's going on in the present status quo. Now, the counter interpretation to that would be that if something had an impact and made democracy worse 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it still manifests itself. Like democracy could still be worse off for that. And so is would still be met, right? Another possible implication of is that we are looking at social media as it actually exists, not some idealized version of what it could be, right? So in the intelligence squared debate, if you watch it, one thing that the affirmative, the side that's debating in favor of social media, talks about is all the potential it has, right? And so by using the word is, the response can be, we're not talking about the potential that social media has to make democracy better or worse 20 or 30 years from now. We're talking about what it's doing now. So you can ignore arguments that speculate about what's going to happen in the future because of the term is, right? The word beneficial, I don't think there's a lot of room for maneuvering here. It's pretty straightforward. Webster defines beneficial as producing good results or helpful effects. So, we're going to be doing a utilitarian analysis of whether social media is good for something. And the question is good for what? And that is really the key, isn't it? Democratic values. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on this, right? I think this is where a fair number of rounds, not most rounds, but a fair number can be won or lost, right? Because unlike a lot of public forum resolutions, you aren't being asked to just make a general argument about whether something is good or bad. Instead, you have to evaluate its effect on a fairly specific and contentious target, a concept, right? Democratic values. And this has a couple of big impacts on how you argue. Right? The first is that it makes the round a little bit more like an LD round. In LD, you literally read a value standard if you have friends who do this, right? It's usually some philosophical concept like justice or morality. And you try to link your side of the resolution to that philosophical concept. And if you do better than your opponent, then you're supposed to win, right? So here the resolution kind of picks that philosophical or at least political concept for you in the form of democratic values. But it leaves a ton of room to define what those values really are, because there are many different definitions and theories about what democratic values look like. It is a somewhat vague, very contentious, very politicized term. And so if democratic values is the goal that pro has to hit, right, both sides are going to have to devote time in their case and really throughout the round to persuading the judge as to what democratic values are and what they really do. I think that's half the debate, right? So for example, as we sort of talked about earlier, if you define democratic values purely in terms of like a majoritarian voting system and free expression, well, heck, it's pretty hard to argue that social media doesn't benefit unfettered expression. If it's all about letting everyone speak their mind and then we go have a majority vote and whatever happens, happens, that's democracy, right? Well, under that view, social media is fantastic because it does facilitate more people talking and expressing their views, no question. But if democratic values include things like positive rights, like the right to security, equality, having certain basic needs met, well, that opens the door to asking what effect social media is having on those as a matter of like policy. Well, what if democratic values are about civic engagement, active participation in voting beyond just stating opinions online? Well, that opens up arguments about turnout, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, if democratic values are about like informed discourse, right? Respect for minority rights, civility, compromise, avoiding polarization, right? As opposed to just having a free-for-all. Well, that's a strong sort of loading of the dice in favor of the con. So hopefully you can see how it's absolutely imperative that both sides devote a significant portion of their case and have blocks ready in their overall strategy on selling the judge on some version of what democratic values are. This requires more than just reading a definition. Frankly, it probably requires a significant portion, 30 seconds or whatever of a 4-minute case, right? It requires evidence and logical support. Now, in terms of mechanics, there's a lot of ways you can do this. You can do it in an observation at the top of the case, right? Or you could do it in a separate contention or maybe as a subpoint at the end of each contention. Like, the last subpoint of each contention is this impacts democratic values because democratic values require blah, 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 according to whoever, right? But however it happens, you have to build a strong foundation of what you're saying democratic values are. So what are some options for framing democratic values in the round? Well, one solid option comes from Stanford political sociologist Larry Diamond in 2004 in a presentation he did called What is Democracy? And he says democracy consists of 4 basic elements, right? Number 1, a political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections. Number 2, active participation of the people as citizens. Number 3, protection of human rights of all citizens. And number 4, rule of law, which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens. Now, this is more or less an even-handed, straight down the middle, fair to both sides formulation. It comes from a very credible source in Diamond, and there's ground on both sides. So if you want to play it straight down the middle and be fair to both sides, great, you can do this, right? There are others, for example, the National Democratic Institute. It's a global NGO promoting democratic government, and it lists the values of democracy as being accountability, transparency, equity, inclusion, pluralism, civic participation, and rule of law. This may lean a little bit more to the pro as it focuses on things like participation and things like holding leaders accountable, right? Which social media arguably does facilitate to some extent. So this might be a solid lean pro option, right? Now, let's be clear. You don't have to go straight down the middle of the road with your definition of democratic values. If you want to look for something that's like less middle of the road and more, I'm going to try to load the dice for my side, that is 100% legitimate, right? And if it were me, I would strongly consider framing democratic values means X as a contention where I just go all in and I'm openly partisan and I try to persuade the judge. I basically look for democratic functions that social media either helps them most or hurts the most, right? I argue that those are key functions of democracy. I look for authors who say that, and then I just I try to load the dice for my side, right? There's nothing wrong with that. So just to give you an example, on the con, you would love to have the judge believe that respect for facts as opposed to misinformation and shared common national interest are like the key to democracy, because there's a strong argument that social media undermines both of those. So like, wouldn't it be cool if there were an author arguing that those are key democratic values? Well, it turns out there is, right? So Professor Jeremy Pitt of the Imperial College in London in 2019 talks about how respect for facts and respect for common interest are core democratic values, right? He says that it may be argue that peak liberal democracy occurred in the 30 years following the Second World War. The period was characterized by two features. First, there was broad-based agreement across the spectrum of opinions on a single, like a set of facts. And second, there's mutual agreement across the spectrum of opinion on a shared set of values of promoting and preserving the national interest, right? Now, can you use Pitt in your con case as contention one? Here is what democratic values are? Absolutely, right? But I'm including him here not for that reason, not to tell you to use him specifically, but to show you that there are plenty of credible authors writing solid pieces on what democracy is and how it works and making arguments about what the essence of a democracy is. It took me 2 minutes on Google to find the Pitt piece, just Googling for respect for facts essential to democracy, right? So you can find people saying that civility is essential and that respect for facts is essential. On the pro side, you absolutely can find people saying that free expression is essential and getting rid of gatekeepers is essential. And I think it is worth considering, at least putting in the time, to find an author who can help you load the dice in your favor and say, here's the target you're shooting for, here's what matters in the round, because this is what the definition of democratic values is. Anyway, end of the day, the bottom line is, here's what you've got to do when it comes to democratic values. Number one, you've got to decide whether you're going to sort of play it straight down the middle with a definition that's more like the Larry Diamond definition and just sort of generically show that social media is good or bad. Or number two, try to make the meaning of democratic values into more of a straight up argument or a contention where you try to win the idea of a more favorable definition that loads the dice in your favor. Whichever of those two that you do, second, you've got to decide where this is going to go in your case, right? If you're more inclined for a straight down the middle approach, it could be a short observation. If you're going to be more overt and try to be more aggressive with these arguments, right, it probably needs to be a contention or something like that, right? And lastly, you need to get ready with your blocks to fight on this. You need to be ready to defend your source. You need to have solid analytics about why your version of democratic values is better, or at least why you shouldn't be subject to some abusive version on the other side, right? Because this is not just an issue where you can read a definition or a framework and forget it. It is a substantive fight that's going to come up throughout the round against good teams, right? And there are lots of good blocks to impacts that don't turn on like what social media does, but rather they turn on what democratic values are. So for example, one potentially powerful framing argument for the pro and block for the pro is the idea that democratic values aren't necessarily the same thing as socially progressive values or like electing better politicians or achieving better policy outcomes. Democracy isn't inherently good or evil. It's just ruled by the majority pursuant to certain rules to protect the minority. So as the con, you could be reading all this really impressive stuff about like misinformation and polarization and incivility, and the pro team might try to turn it by saying, yeah, but that's exactly what democracy is, right? It's rough and tumble. It's not polite. It's an ideological battle, but that's just what you have to do. That's what you have to put up with if you want the people to be in charge, which is just how democracy works. To put it more bluntly, the pro might argue that the values of democracy aren't necessarily always societally good values. In fact, they can sometimes be harmful. In other words, Kahn argues that social media undermines civil discourse, turn the entire case because democracy itself is 100% compatible with undermining civil discourse. Now, is this a little edgy? Yeah, but it's not a fringe position, right? This is how Aristotle viewed democracy. He thought that it undermined the rule of law and respect for facts. And there's actually a very good article about this by Julian Baggini in 2018 that we'll link to, right? It's weird, right? In public forum, we're talking about Aristotle. We usually do this in the LD videos, right? Now, we don't have anything close to time in this video to do a survey of all the philosophical views on this. I will try to put what I can in the links. We barely have time to cover the substance because there's so much of it, which is why it's such a great topic, right? You can hear how fast I'm talking. I'm glad I'm talking to debaters right now. Anyway, we spent as much time as we can on this. We have to move on to the substance. But I am strongly advising you to devote a significant amount of time in your research to really think thinking and preparing for different understandings of democratic values, how they can be used strategically to alter the decision calculus and to flip the playing field, like to really throw your opponent for a loop based on what democratic values are, especially if they're not prepared to argue them, especially if you run up against a good team whose entire preparation for democratic values is like a one-line or two-line observation in like one block card. You can absolutely roll people like that if you're really, really ready to fight on this. You don't have to do it in every round, but if you're ready to, it can be a huge advantage. Anyway, it's finally time to stop talking about the framing and to move on and talk about what you've all been waiting for, which is some of the pro arguments. So let's do that right now. Okay, so on the pro. Pro probably does have a slight disadvantage on this topic. It's not as unbalanced as I thought when I started researching this, but I think there is still a little bit of an uphill battle for the pro for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's just going to be more research and writing out there about the downsides of social media because that's just more attractive, as a topic to write about and to have opinions about. Scholars and commentators are just more drawn to identifying problems than saying, oh, hey, isn't this great? Isn't this wonderful? Isn't everything working as planned, right? And second, and probably more importantly at this tournament, we've all just lived through some major historical events that, at least in the minds of many, highlight the problems with social media, right? Trump's use of Twitter to spread false information and in some cases spread intolerance, social media being used to promote falsehoods about the election, right? And I think the pro needs to sort of acknowledge that elephant in the room, might come in and say something like, look, we know you hear a lot about how social media tends to be negative because negative news sells. But when you compare the United States with social media to a world without it, it's clear that we are a more democratic country, right? In other words, I think the pro needs to, in so many words, acknowledge that, yes, right now the hot take is that social media is bad, right? Bad for democracy. But if you just calm down a little bit and you take a longer view and you look at the long-term impact that it's having in its relatively short existence, the news is surprisingly good. And I think the pro in this debate is going to be the side of being calm and cool and rational and reviewing the data and taking the long-term view. And I think that approach helps disarm a lot of the more alarmist, troubling stuff that you get on the con in the post-Trump Twitter era. And the evidence for the pro is surprisingly strong. I was really pleased and happy with what I saw. So let's just jump right into it. There's a lot to cover. So first, social media empirically helps promote democracy, right? So we're going to be dealing with a lot of narratives and stories and concepts later on. But first, let's get started with some of the hard data, right? It is good to have hard empirical data, if you can find it, in your back pocket to sort of cut the Gordian knot, right? The expression that we use, and just try to sort of empirically deny the claims by the con. A public forum is an event that goes fast, the speeches are short, and sometimes rather than just getting tied up in a lengthy debate about what might happen or could happen, it's just good to have data that said, no, that doesn't happen, that didn't happen. So right at the outset, I want to point you to a fantastic central source for empirical data on the effect of social media on the internet and on policy outcomes, and this is from Zurovskaya, I think, in 2020, and this is from the Annual Review of Economics. And what this is basically just a rundown summary, right, of dozens of scholarly articles that do actual empirical research on social media and the internet more generally and their measurable impacts on democracy and like on policy outcomes in particular, right? Now these articles, just let me say, this is the pro section of the video, but they do cut both ways. This is not a predominantly pro-leaning source or con-leaning source. Now we're going to look at some of the specifics in a second, but this is really just a place you need to go mine for sources in general, right? Is it every piece of empirics out there? Is it every study, every piece of data? No, of course not, but it's a lot. And it's all in one place, and it has clear summaries and links. Some of them are behind paywalls, but for many of those, you can find the text if you do a little Googling. So, and what can I say, but hey, you're welcome, right? This is a really good source that you need to go mine, and it's a great place to start your empirical research. In terms of specific studies that can help the pro in particular, there is this from Ja and Kodila Tadika, I think that's how you say it, in 2019. This is a study of Facebook penetration in democracy in 125 countries, and this is a study that compares basically how much Facebook usage you have in a given country with their Freedom House score for like democratization, right? So Freedom House looks at things like the right to participation, fairness in the electoral process, things like that. And the finding that they have is, quote, we find the evidence of a strong positive correlation between Facebook penetration as a proxy for social media and democracy. We further show that the correlation between social media and democracy is stronger for low-income countries and higher in than in higher income countries, right? So the upside for the pros, this is broad, robust evidence of correlation of better democratic values when you have more social media usage. The downside, and the critique that the con would use, is that the benefits are strongest in low-income countries. That may imply that these are countries that maybe have a little bit more suppression of media or a little bit less access to media in general. But it is a good study for sort of a general overview of the correlation between better democracy scores and social media usage. Now, another option that looks specifically at social media use as opposed to just like how many people download the app is from Salzman 2018. And this is about how social media use promotes democratic values in Latin America. This looks at survey data from people who are or are not social media users in 8 Latin American countries and finds, quote, the analysis reveals statistically significant results in the hypothesized direction, strong evidence that Latin Americans who use social media for political purposes are in fact more tolerant of opponents than individuals who do not use social media in the same way, right? So this is showing the more you're using social media in Latin American countries, the more tolerant you are of other views, right? These are, of course, not focused. One of them is not in the United States at all. The other is not focused on the United States, but they're really good, and sort of in terms of setting the table about the general effects. Now, if you're looking for some pro evidence from the United States in particular, it's a little less definitive, but there are some good examples. So one would be Fujiwara and others in 2021, and this is about Twitter usage reducing the likelihood of Trump support, right? We'll talk about why that matters in a second, right, for democracy. But what they say is, we estimate that a 10% increase in a county's number of Twitter users lowered the vote share of Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump by 0.2 percentage points in both 2016 and 2020. The implied persuasion rates are 8.6 and 9.4% respectively, which are smaller than the estimated pro-Republican effects of Fox News, but they're still pretty, significant, right? This is very recent. It's from this year in May. It's from a Princeton researcher, so it seems to be credible. Because it measures Twitter usage over time in these counties, it's not just saying, well, Twitter users tend to lean left, right? It's showing change over time. The more people get on Twitter in a county, the more it seems to persuade them not to support Trump. Now, obviously, the caveat here is you have to link the idea of not supporting Trump as being good for democracy. Now, that may be a little controversial in some parts of the country. You might not run it here in Mississippi at a local tournament. I don't know. And there is some risk to it. Could you have a super conservative judging around? It's possible, right? Frankly, I think it's a risk worth taking, right? Given the judging pool that you have at a tournament like NSDA, right? Debate judges tend to lean a little to the left. Most of your younger folks tend to lean a little bit that way, not always by any stretch. And there's just a lot of strong evidence that you can put into a contention that, like, Trump just doesn't reflect democratic values. Whatever you think of him politically, he's not civil. He doesn't believe in compromise. He doesn't respect institutions. He doesn't respect minorities, right? He led essentially an attempt to overthrow an election he did not like based on a falsehood, right? And I think it's a risk, but this is a good piece of evidence that if you think Trump is anti-democratic, well, Twitter is anti-Trump, right? And that's a nifty piece of empirics. A little bit of risk, potentially high reward, right? So moving on from the empirics, so there are a lot of them, right? But we have to, because of time, move on to some more of the qualitative arguments as opposed to just the purely quantitative ones, right? There are others, of course, out there, and we'll try to link to as many as we can. But we've just got to move on because of time, right? So the next argument is that social media facilitates documenting and publicizing injustices, right? And there are numerous examples of this, but the biggest one is going to be police brutality. So Kochi 2021 has an article from Voice of America News about how social media was essential to publicizing the George Floyd killing, right? And it says, Adams pointed to social media as having a huge impact on Chauvin's conviction. Without videos, incidents like this would happen with no one knowing, she said. Videotaping puts a spotlight on the racism and bigotry we have in our criminal justice system that some people may not have realized before. And there's another piece on this from Kim in Vox in 2020, and it talks about how social media videos are resulting in more police discipline. So there's actually a measurable impact as these videos spread online. They have further incensed citizens advocating for stricter police regulations, while others are having even more tangible impacts. Some city officials have responded to the videos by opening investigations into the depicted incidents, putting the offending officers on administrative leave, or even terminating them from their positions, right? And you can go on and find more evidence of how we're seeing more, movement toward police reform and things along those lines. But it's not just police reform. It's not just documenting like police abuse like the George Floyd case. More broadly, and this is kind of a related point, social media builds and sustains democratic and justice-related movements that might have died out in previous eras, right, before social media. So Blevins and Lee in 2020 talk about how social media has been a major sustaining force for things like, Black Lives Matter more broadly, right? Occupy Wall Street, Arab Spring, and other protest movements, right? It talks about how, fatal shooting of an unarmed black teenager in Ferguson, Missouri, spawned this hashtag of Black Lives Matter, and how how this was, a major national movement. And then it actually compares it to a similar instance in 2001, before the birth of social media, in Cincinnati's Over the Rhine neighborhood, right, where a similar incident happened and there were a few protests, but it really didn't come to anything, right, because people couldn't coordinate and couldn't share the message. And so that's a good apples to apples comparison of what happens in a world with social media and what happens in a world without social media. You get more of an ability to protest injustice, which should be, good for democracy. Maryville University actually has a decent webpage that does a summary of how social media has been instrumental in spreading other movements like the Love Wins movement for marriage equality, the Me Too movement against sexual harassment and assault. The article links to statistics about how these movements went viral, and how it also explains the mechanics of how social media helps them do this, right? Coordinating responses, right? So like in the Cincinnati case that we just mentioned, it's not just 100 disconnected people doing unrelated things that gets no traction, right? It's a coordinated national effort that actually results in attention, and in some cases in reform and change, right? It also talks about how it gives a platform to lived experiences, right? Showing that people actually do experience police abuse. Or on the other side of the coin, showing a same-sex couple getting married. They're just normal people. They're nice, normal people. See, they're just like you, right? Or a woman being assaulted by a boss. And people see these things and say, oh my gosh, there are other people in the world who've been through what I've been through or have seen what I've seen. We should get together and make a change. Now, a related point to this is the idea that democracy has become objectively better in many respects in the United States during the social media era, right? I don't know if this is a standalone contention, but I think it is a powerful narrative that can run through like the entire pro case. And what it is, look, while we have had our ups and downs, right, overall in the era since the creation of social media, we have seen tremendous gains for democratic values in the United States. So the social media era began around 2005, right? Facebook was founded in 2004, YouTube in 2005, Twitter in 2006. And the question is basically, what has happened to American democracy since then? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? Right now, it might be tempting, and this is again pulling back the camera and saying, let's be calm and cool about this, right? It might be tempting to look at Trump's Twitter and the January 6th insurrection and all this stuff and say, oh, social media has made it terrible. But if you really pull back, that's not true. There have been a lot of measurable improvements to democracy in the United States since 2005 or 2006. We have elected and re-elected the country's first black president. We have elected the country's first female vice president. Over 20 states voted to make marriage equality the law for same-sex couples, and then the Supreme Court made it a constitutional right in 2015. And despite some recent attempts by Republicans to roll back, voter access and some of these laws that we're seeing right now, we have actually seen massive expansion of voting access, right? By 2021, 39 states had no excuse, you didn't have to have a reason, like early voting. That was not true in 2024. This study here from Professor Michael McDonald talks about just as one example, right, the rise of early voting, and it shows how, back at the turn of the century, you had about maybe 15% of Americans casting early ballots. And today, 15, 16 years after the birth of social media, it's more than doubled to 30%. And I'm sure you can find other statistics about how it's actually easier to vote now. Again, we know that Republicans in the last few months have passed some laws to try to partly pull back on some of these things, but it's actually a lot easier to vote than it was at the start of the social media era, right? Now, I don't know if you're going to make a discrete contention out of this. You can, like a separate contention. Again, it's more of a general theme. The con points to something bad, and you say, look, you've got to look at the big picture. Compare the United States today to what it was in 2004 in terms of things like voting, who we have elected, what our laws look like for minorities and for disenfranchised groups, right? It doesn't automatically prove that social media was the cause of all these things, but it does help load the dice against the con and say, look, you can't have to explain how things have gotten so much better overall if social media is this terrible thing, right? So getting to more specific stuff in terms of outcomes, like we can look to voter turnout, right? And I want to thank, actually we have a viewer, I'll just give the first name, her name's Alice. You guys are kids, so I'm not going to do like last names, but she actually sent us some stuff she'd used at her state tournament, which also used this topic, and I thought it was really good. So one of the things she sent us was a Procaccia 20 card that explains that in the run-up to the 2020 election, social media feeds were inundated by people's proud announcements that their mail-in ballots had been received and recorded. Such posts may have contributed to the election's record turnout. And then she talks about like voter registration. So Bursinski, I may be saying that wrong. Facebook said Monday its apps have helped 4.4 million people register to vote. Fisher 20 says more than 733,000 Americans registered to vote on Snapchat, right? And the broad reach of these platforms makes them uniquely effective at engaging voters. So that's really good stuff. There is even better empirical support for the idea of voter turnout and voter registration. So Bond and others in 2012 did a study of Facebook's impact on actual voter turnout. Now, 2012 is a while ago. It's eons in social media time. But, this was published in the journal Nature, which is incredibly, strong, credible source. And what it concluded was that Facebook was probably accountable for an additional net 340,000 votes in the 2010 election, which is an off-year election. So that's, it's a significant number of votes. It's a net benefit to democracy through participation. And it's a good, sort of well-sourced, credible source to look at. Moving on, another potential argument just related to impacts, right, is that social media lets more diverse groups impact the legislative agenda. And this is from Lewinstein in 2019, and it's a case study of how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, just AOC, right, is an example of how social media empowers outsiders to help set the agenda. And what it talks about is how she's a perfect case study because she has used her social media to become disproportionately influential in her first term and now her second term in Congress in a way that you couldn't have done before, right? She is a master of social media. She basically takes her case directly to the people, not just in her own district, but right across the country. And this has made her one of the most influential Democrats in the House of Representatives. In the past, right, you just had to sort of sit and wait your turn. You had to wait years or even decades to become a senior member of the House of Representatives and have an influence on policy. But here, social media enables, representatives who are more linked to the ideas of younger people and who want change and who want to push for change, Green New Deal and that sort of stuff, right, to have an influence more quickly, which means that the House of Representatives and the Congress is more responsive to these ideas, right? This links to, I guess, another sort of broader point, which is that social media arguably makes leaders more responsive in general, right? So democracy only works when representatives actually respond to the demands of their constituents, right? It's all just for show if there's no policy outcome, right? And social media lets people interact with their representatives much more easily. If you compare what you had to do in 1990 or whatever, go write a letter on a piece of paper, put it in an envelope, look up the address, which you didn't have the internet to do, right? Put a stamp on it, mail it, wait a few weeks, and hopefully somebody reads it, right? Or at least pick up the phone and make a phone call to your representative. Well, now all you have to do is take 15 seconds and write a comment underneath their latest social media post. And the Christian Science Monitor in 2015 had an article about how actually congressional staffs are responsive to these comments. And it found that according to a study by the Congressional Management Foundation, 80% of congressional staffers said that they did pay attention to and did respond to as few as 30 comments on a lawmaker's post on Facebook or Twitter. So you can get a response, a substantive paying of attention much more easily now than you could have previously. Also on the local level, there's this piece, it's a case study about the use of Twitter by local officials. This was a mayor of Seoul, South Korea. This was the only empirical evidence I could find on how local officials are more responsive. Maybe you can find some others. We will include it. But I can tell you from personal experience, living here in Starkville, which is a small town, our mayor is incredibly active on Twitter. She responds directly to constituents within minutes, sometimes hours, in many cases minutes. All of our aldermen, school board, they're all on Twitter, or most of them are at least, and they're very responsive, and it's a way that you can speak directly to them. And I think you'll find that local officials, are much more responsive. And by the way, citing local officials being more responsive might be a good way to throw a curveball at the con, because most everybody is going to be focusing heavily on national level politics, but you could make the argument, that most of the ways in which democracy affects our lives, is local. Policies for our local schools and trash pickup and zoning and things like that have a direct impact on our lives. And if you can you speak and confer with local officials more easily, that's a big improvement to democracy. You shouldn't understate that, because that's what affects people's real day-to-day lives, right? Another argument is that it encourages real-world political participation. This is from Ahmad and others 2019, and it talks about how a study, and this is again from Pakistan, a lot of these studies come from other countries, but you just have to be able to argue by analogy, and it says the study suggests that online political activities strongly correlate to political awareness and offline political participation. There's another piece from Granger Fry in 2018 that actually looks at this in the United States in 2018, and it finds that for 4 different types of political acts, like contacting an official, donating to a campaign, participating in a rally, and voting, that social media usage correlates positively with all of those. So there's a lot of evidence out there of varying qualities, but there is evidence that suggests that actual real-world participation correlates well with social media usage. Now, on this point about the link between real-world activity and social media usage, there was another point I wanted to make that may be sort of more of a block, but it is interesting. And that's the idea that even like passive activism, even like a low level of activity, is a net gain for democracy. In other words, what we sort of call as online slacktivism, right? The idea that I will retweet or share something that you say about politics. I might even make a small donation or something along those lines, but I won't really heavily get involved. And sometimes this is seen in a pejorative light, and there are some arguments that the con might run about how slacktivism isn't really doing anything. It's like a placebo. It makes you feel like you're doing something, but you're not. But there's this piece from Gonzalez Bailon in 2015 about how slacktivism is actually a major gain for social movements. And what it talks about is how, for any social movement that you have this core group of people that's super active, but then you have this outer group of people who might just do a little bit. They might share things on their social media. They might have a Facebook post, a tweet, or something like that. And that their role is to amplify and echo the messages from the core group. And in many cases, according to this study, right, these slacktivists might just tweet once or twice, but they can actually double the reach of the message of the core protest group, right? So if people say, oh, well, folks aren't doing very much, they're passive, they just tweet something and then they don't do anything else, this is good evidence to say that just tweeting it, right, just retweeting it, just sharing it or whatever by itself is enough to cause a significant increase in the reach of the message, right? So it's a net good, right? So a couple of potential response arguments or blocks that I wanted to include before we move on to the con. One is the idea that political polarization, which is going to be a major point that we talk about on the con, right, about how social media leads to polarization, arguably is not actually caused by social media. Right, and there's actually some solid empirical evidence on this. So Boxell and others in 2017 actually have a study on why polarization does not correlate with social media usage, right? It says, by many measures, Americans have become increasingly polarized. We study the role of the internet and social media. What they do is they combine 8 previously proposed measures to construct like an index of polarization. And what they find from their index, right, is that polarization has increased the most among the demographic groups that are least likely to use the internet and social media, right? So overall, people who are over 65, right, people who are the least likely to be involved in social media see the most polarization. In other words, I hate to say this, but the people who are in many cases watching Fox News, right, are becoming polarized much faster than those in the demographic between 18 and 39 who are much more likely to, right? And there are a couple of other sources on this. The Morris Fiorina in 2018 and Genskow in 2016 who summarized some of the historical data. And we'll drop links to both of them, but they both suggest that polarization is something that has been going on in the United States and on the rise for a long time. It really correlates more with the rise of talk radio, like for example Rush Limbaugh, with the rise of Fox News and things along those lines. It really does not correlate very heavily with the rise of social media. Another related point on this is that filter bubbles don't increase polarization. They may actually slightly mitigate it. So the filter bubble, as we'll talk about in a second, is the idea that the algorithms on social media are designed to tell you things that you agree with, right? They're designed to find things that they think you will like. And so they tend to, over time, whether consciously, like because you block people, or unconsciously through the algorithm, they filter out differing views and you only see what you agree with, right? And the idea, the thought is that this is supposed to lead to polarization, but the study here by Bale and others in 2018 says that no, actually it may be the opposite of that. And what they find basically is that exposure to opposing views on social media actually can increase your political polarization. So it sounds counterintuitive, but the empirics that they cite here suggest that the less you are exposed to sort of angry or belligerent views on the other side, the less polarized you are. And so this is a nice potential empirical block to the idea of polarization. You say it's not happening, right? Yes, you might only see things you agree with, right? But it's just not leading you to be more polarized. So that's what I've got on the pro. It was a lot. I'm glad it was a lot. I didn't know it was going to be that robust, but I think there's a lot of arguments you can make. So with that, let's move on now and talk a little bit about the con. All right, so on the con, I think it's really very much kind of the inverse of what you do on the pro. When I'm on the con, the image I want in the judge's mind above all others is the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, the misinformation about alleged election fraud, the big lie, as it's called, right? The voter suppression laws passed in the wake of all that, and really just how social media helped spread that information and helped spread the hostility that led to those things, right? I want them thinking about Trump's racist and false tweets, about social media rumors paralyzing the response to COVID, and so on. And I also want them thinking about how this was not accidental, right? How social media algorithms aren't doing this by accident. They are designed to be addictive and to overcome rational thought by preying on our insecurities and our fears, right? They're not just these happy little birds tweeting around, right? They're designed to keep you coming back by any means, and that's not a good way to ensure objective, unbiased decision making in a democracy. And I think you have to really talk about these things in very frank terms when you're on the con. As I mentioned earlier, right, about how this has really been sort of the low point for U.S. democracy, arguably, since the Civil War, and how it would not have been possible without social media to allow demagogues to whip poorly informed voters into a frenzy, so to speak. And I think this requires speaking in a way that's a little bit different than what many PF teams are used to, not just, sort of blippy little bullet points and impacts, but really kind of telling a story with a narrative. But before we get to telling that story, it is important that we kind of start out with the empirics. So as we did, on the pro side, I think, start out with the empirical arguments. And there's a really good succinct one, I think, and it is that democratic values have just objectively declined during the rise of social media, right? So Freedom House is an NGO, well-respected NGO, that does annual rankings of democracy in countries around the world, every country in the world. Every year they do this sort of apples-to-apples comparison as an impartial outside observer of just how democratic, each country in the world is. And they look at factors like electoral processes, pluralism, free expression, rule of law, personal autonomy, and they assign a score, right? So how has the United States fared since, the beginning of the social media era? Well, in 2006, the year Twitter was created, the year after Facebook was created, the United States scored 93, so one of the highest scores in the world. By 2016, it was down to a 90. By 2020, it was an 86. And at 2021, it sits at an all-time low of 83, below countries like Antigua, Belize, the Czech Republic, and Latvia, right? And so what this allows you to do is kind of the flip side of what we talked about on the pro, which is to say, look, objectively speaking, when outside expert respected groups rank the democracy in this country, what we've seen during the social media era is a marked decline from one of the highest scores to a much more mediocre score. Now, does that prove that social media is the cause? No, but it effectively creates a presumption that you can put on the pro and say, look, pro, if you think that social media is so great for democracy, how do you explain this marked decline in this well-respected objective metric, right? And it sort of puts the burden on them to explain why things are getting worse if social media is so great, right? Now, you can't just rely on that, though. You have to tell a story about why we think social media contributes to the decline in democracy. And I think you have to start that by talking about how social media is really built and designed to exploit our irrational impulses and how this is bad for democracy, right? So democracy depends on reasoned discourse, not like angry mobs with pitchforks. Social media, though, has algorithms, right? It's built around algorithms that are intentionally designed to prey on impulsive, angry aspects of human behavior. So in short, it's foolish to think that a product designed to get us hooked on outrage and groupthink is somehow going to suddenly make us into a more deliberative democratic country, right? And in terms of evidence on this, I think the best place to start is with the testimony of Tim Kendall, who's the former director of monetization for Facebook from 2006 to 2010. And he gave testimony before the House Energy and Commerce Committee in 2020, and it was really, pretty damning, right? Here's what he says. He says, "We took a page from Big Tobacco's playbook, working to make our offering addictive at the outset. Facebook's algorithm maximizes your attention by hitting you repeatedly with content that triggers your strongest emotions. It aims to provoke shock and enrage. Facebook and their cohorts worship at the altar of engagement and cast all other concerns aside, raising the voices of division, anger, hate, and misinformation to drown out the voices of truth, justice, morality, and peace, right? This is extremely powerful, right? Because it's coming from one of the guys who helped design Facebook's monetization system, the very thing that we're talking about today, how they turn clicks and views into money, right? It's not just him. April Doss, Georgetown law professor, I believe. It's not really clear what her position is. I think she's at Georgetown Law. But in 2020, has a piece on how algorithms in social media are directly leading to extremism. So one of the first points she makes is how Facebook admits it's basically designed to hook you with extremism, right? What she says is Facebook's own research concluded that 64% of people who joined extremist groups on the platform did so because Facebook's own algorithms recommended the content, right? Facebook's own former executives have testified they designed the platform to be addictive to maximize Facebook's profits by maximizing user engagement, right? And she goes on to point out that experts basically agree that these algorithms get exploited by bad actors. So she talks about how after the 2016 interference in the US election by Russia, many different, credible groups conducted extensive studies about how likely it was that different bad actor groups around the world would use Facebook and other companies' algorithms to spread misinformation. This was the Senate Intelligence Committee, UK House of Commons, and many others. And they all uniformly, emphatically concluded, right, that in fact these groups were likely to continue doing this, right? And the last thing she has in the piece that I saw that I thought was pretty good is essentially a block. And what she says is that recent changes have not helped the situation. So, one argument might be that Facebook in 2017 tried to begin this shift toward changing its algorithm to make it less prone to give you incendiary information or to have filter bubbles and things like that. She points out that there's really no empirical evidence that this has worked at all, that it's had any change in the spread of extremist content. And she says, as a matter of fact, there might be an argument that it's gotten worse with groups like QAnon and the Boogaloo Boys, showing up armed and having their supporters run for office using Facebook as a platform, right? So there's no real evidence that those changes have had any positive impact, right? So next point in terms of telling the story is that social media increases political polarization, right? So if it's going to be by design exploiting our worst impulses, what does that result in? Well, part of what it results in is a more polarized electorate, right? And the first thing you have to do is establish why polarization is bad. So like polarization is antithetical to democracy. This is from Mola, or it may be Moya, I'm not sure, 2020, about how the social media filter bubbles drive polarization. And what they say is the result is a political sectarianism in which one's party identity seems to come first before policy, religion, or common ground. Political identity in turn shapes our other views instead of the other way around. The results of this kind of alignment are disastrous for a functioning democracy. As researchers argue, holding opposing partisans in contempt on the basis of their identity alone precludes innovative cross-party solutions and mutually beneficial compromises, right? So we are seeing a curtailment in the ability of democracy to solve problems. And that should be pretty apparent with how gridlocked Congress is, because we don't view each other as people, because social media reinforces these bubbles in which we only see what we agree with, right? Eli Pariser, I think that's how you say it, in 2011, has a really good quote on this that's been used by a number of folks, which is ultimately democracy works only if we citizens are capable of thinking beyond our narrow self-interest. But to do so, we need a shared view of the world we cohabit. We need to come into contact with other people's lives and needs and desires. The filter bubble, right, of social media pushes us in the opposite direction. It creates the impression that our narrow self-interest is all that exists. And while this is great for getting people to shop online, it's not great for getting people to make better decisions together. So having established that social that filter bubbles and polarization are bad, we need to have the empirical evidence that social media facilitates polarization. So Allcott and others in 2020 have a really interesting study in which they did a clear apples-to-apples comparison. They got people to delete their Facebook during the run-up, the 4 weeks run-up to the 2018 midterm election. And what they found is that empirically, this resulted in a decline in the polarization of their views. Now, it also resulted, notably, in some decline in factual knowledge about news, but that may just be because they were using Facebook at the time to get information and they had to change it. I don't know. But there is an empirical, study supporting the idea that when you get off Facebook, same person, right? It's an apples to apples comparison. Person A is on, they're more polarized. Person A gets off, they're less polarized. So that's a good study. Chinelli in 2021 talks about empirical evidence that social media facilitates these ideological filter bubbles. And what they did is they performed an analysis of more than 100 million pieces of content concerning controversial topics like gun control, vaccination, and abortion on various social media platforms. And they found that the discussions of them tended to aggregate together, very clearly, and that the bias displayed in any given conversation was overwhelmingly the same. In other words, if you were having a conversation about gun control, overwhelmingly it was going to be a conversation that was in favor of gun control or against gun control, not like a two-sided conversation. So this is pretty solid empirical evidence that when people discuss things online, they tend to have what they call homophily, right, or same-mindedness, right, in their discussion overwhelmingly, right? The next point I have is that social media provides a platform for hate groups. Social media makes it dramatically easier to organize hate groups, militia groups, and others who oppose democratic values like pluralism, but who might not be willing to go and meet in person. Like they don't want to go and actually meet with the white supremacist group or whatever in their town, right? Now this can be used either as offense, to show that obviously hate groups are bad, right? Bad for democracy, right? That's not a good way to run a democracy. It can also be used as defense if, for example, the pro runs these arguments that groups like Black Lives Matter are benefited from social media. You can say, well, it's a two-way street, right? It's a double-edged sword. For every good group, you have groups like hate groups that are also using social media to organize, right? So a couple of points here. One is that it facilitates discussion of violence and extremism. So Kiana Gardner from the Center for Public Integrity in 2018 has this piece that talks about how social media was used in organizing the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which ended in violence and death. Basically, a bunch of like-minded users got together to plan a protest against the removal of Confederate statues. And it talks about how they use the social media to discuss what weapons they would bring, how to build these improvised weapons, the logistics of running a vehicle into the expected crowds of counter-protesters. And in fact, that is exactly what happened, right? Heather Heyer was killed after one of these folks rammed his car into a group of the demonstrators, right? Another point on this from Harriman and others in 2020 is that social media is essential to hate group recruiting. And what they talk about here is how online spaces provide uniquely good opportunities for recruiting for hate groups. They allow them to portray an image of unity and identity. This online collective identity perpetuates as a welcoming space of like-minded individuals, providing sought-after validation for potential members' societal grievances and attracting socially isolated individuals to become members of a community that accepts them. And lastly, and I think this is really important in terms of an impact, right? It leads to actual hate crimes. So Mueller, I think it's Mueller, maybe Mueller and Schwartz in 2020 talk about how social media use actually correlates with real-world anti-refugee hate crimes. And what they did is they looked at periods in which there was a high number of anti-refugee posts on right-wing social media. And what they found is that these correlated with actual anti-refugee hate crimes in areas that have higher Facebook usage, right? So this was an empirical one-to-one correlation, not one-to-one, but an empirical correlation between right-wing sort of anti-refugee posts and actual anti-refugee hate crimes, right? The next point, and I think this one is super important, is that social media facilitates the spread of misinformation and false information. So MIT has a summary of research on social media and false information that they produced in 2020, and you may have seen this before, but one of the big things they start with is that false rumors spread faster and wider than true information on Facebook. And this is according to a 2019 study published in the journal Science by MIT professor Sinan Aral and some others. And what they found is that falsehoods are 70% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter than the truth, and they reach their first 1,500 people 6 times faster, right? As they say, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth can get out of bed, right? This is a great apples to apples comparison to use against pro claims about greater access to information. What this says, and this is a widely quoted statistic, you see it a lot just in popular discourse, but what it says is whatever gains you get in true information, you're getting commensurately more increases in false information. So yes, of course, there's some good, valuable information on social media. Nobody denies that, but you're seeing, 70% more likelihood of retweeting and a much faster spread of things that are not true, right? Another point that is made in that same MIT summary is that some of this information that comes from politicians actually helps them. It says that under certain circumstances, people appreciate a candidate who tells obvious lies, even seeing that candidate as, quote, more authentic, according to research from a couple of other MIT professors. And it says a norm-breaking candidate who tells lies appeals to aggrieved constituencies because these voters see norms as illegitimately imposed by the establishment. In other words, this helps to frame and explain why Trump, frankly, telling pretty obvious lies can be a rewarding thing for him, right? Now, the impact of these things, the spreading of misinformation, is jeopardizing the ability of democracy to function at all. And this is arguably the most important story that I think many cons are going to want to tell. Remember, on election night, Trump and his supporters began a series of these largely social media-based claims, these tweets, right, that the election was being stolen. Right? It happened even before the election, but it really started on election night. And the BBC in January 2021 had a really good timeline of all the social media messages from Trump himself leading up to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, right? We don't have anywhere near the time to cover all of them, but basically these were false, baseless claims that the election was being stolen. Now, regular media didn't generally give too much credence. Most networks started calling them accurately false, right? Almost immediately. And even Fox News was careful about what they said and had disclaimers about, well, we don't know if this is true, right? But on social media, Trump and his allies like Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Matt Gaetz, and others were just making up these insane fact-free claims about fraud, and his supporters were just eating it up by the millions. And this led, as the BBC shows, on a straight line to attempts to get the House of Representatives to ignore the certified election results of swing states that Biden won. This led to 147 Republicans in the House voting not to certify the election. And I think you have to be emphatic about this in the round. This was a vote by these 147 Republicans to end American democracy. When you throw out election results from a presidential election, just throw them out without overwhelming evidence of fraud, and there was no evidence of fraud here, right? You are basically voting to end democracy. That's the end of a democracy right there, right? And while this was going on, thousands and thousands of Trump supporters were storming the Capitol, attacking Capitol Police in an attempt to stop the steal because Trump had told them to do this repeatedly in tweets throughout the preceding weeks. He told them in the December 19th tweet that they needed to be there and be wild, right? So, and in addition to this, these insurgents, right, used social media themselves to plan the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Heilweil and Gaffrey in 2021 talk about how they used things like Twitter, YouTube, Parler, and many other sites to basically plan and coordinate the attack on the Capitol. And without putting too fine a point on it and me getting too riled up about it, I think you have to talk about this. I have to say this is as close as the United States has gotten to the dissolution of our democracy since the Civil War. This is the kind of thing that does not happen in developed countries, and it was all facilitated by social media. It could not have happened without social media. Regular mainstream media would not have run with these claims anywhere near the way that we saw social media do, right? How close do we have to get to the precipice of ending our democracy before we admit that social media is facilitating an existential threat, right? So turning from that to some other arguments, this next one is not the strongest, but I want to address it. It's the idea that foreign influence, right? So, foreign influence in theory is bad, right? Democracy means self-determination. And if it's interfered with, regardless of the intent, that does seem to be inherently anti-democratic. The problem is, when we're talking about Russian interference in 2016 and 2020, it's very, very difficult to quantify whether it had any measurable impact on the outcome, right? I see a lot of folks talking about how this is a strong argument and people, saying it should go in the case. The problem is, like Nate Silver, 538 in 2018 had a really good piece about how it's almost impossible to quantify whether Russian interference efforts and troll farms and things like that had any measurable impact. Bale and others in 2020 specifically talk about how there is no evidence, right? 2 years after Nate Silver's piece, there's just really no reliable evidence. Now, that doesn't mean there's no impact here. There's a piece by Iskin Jarzdak, I think in 2020 from the Stanford Daily, about how psychologically this can have an impact on the credibility of U.S. elections. If we make people believe that the elections are in doubt, then that in and of itself hurts democracy. It hurts our U.S. international leadership. It hurts our ability to carry out subsequent elections, right? And you can back that up with AP polls showing that 74% of Americans are concerned about the impact of Russian interference. in 2020. But at the end of the day, the marginal impact, right, of these efforts to disrupt was really, it seems to be very small compared to what the actual candidates do and what the pundits do and what the interest groups do and what regular Americans voters do, right, on social media. So I don't think it's a top tier contention, but it's worth knowing. Now, another, I think, pretty strong argument is that social media leaves users less informed about events. And social media has become a major source of news for Americans. Mitchell and others at the Pew Research Center in 2020 do a great, lengthy, detailed breakdown of social media's impact on news consumers, like social media as a news source. How does that affect consumers of news, right? And what it notes is that 18% of Americans get their news mainly from social media, with that number rising dramatically to 48% for the age range from 18 to 29. So really, really big source of news for younger folks. Those who do rely on social media for their primary news source are among the least knowledgeable Americans, with 57% having low political knowledge compared to just 23% for people who use news websites and 31% for people who primarily use print media. They're also the most likely to hear conspiracy theories, like the idea that COVID was planned, right, and deliberate, and they're also the least likely to be worried about the impact of fake news, suggesting that they are not only susceptible to misinformation and ignorance, but also poorly informed about just how misinformed and ignorant they are, right? A related point on this is that social media is making other media outlets and sources worse. So David Adkins in 2021 talks about how social media is eroding more responsible media. And it talks about how Google and Facebook together have combined to rob journalists of a reliable revenue model by acting as both platform and publisher, scooping up almost all the advertising money and creating virtually none of the content, right? And what he says is that basically this is really harmful to the health of journalism because gone are the days when you could just read Newsweek for free at the dentist office or pay for a single copy of The Economist at a local newsstand. Everything is now about clicks. Clicks are driven by social media, and social media makes almost all the dough, and both the quality and quantity of journalism suffer as a result. And so this is just a piece about how even media sources like Newsweek, right, and others that are not social media in themselves fall into the model of social media because they get seen through social media in many cases, and they have to resort to things like clickbait, right? Which is why you see Newsweek, for example, going from being like, when I was in high school, Newsweek was like the gold standard or one of the gold standards for credible sources that you would cite and extemp and debate. And today it's a borderline tabloid, right? Because it has succumbed to, the online news model of like clickbait, right? Another argument I don't think is super strong, worth mentioning, is the idea that social media allows corporations to censor and silence discourse. And yes, it's true. Twitter does have a very powerful ability to take the president of the United States off of social media to take away his platform. That's a lot of power. The problem is it's kind of hard to argue that we're worse off under social media than we were without it, right? It's hard to argue that we have more gatekeeping in a world where you have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and all of these than in a world where 3 TV networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and a handful of big newspapers like pretty much decided what made the news, right? So, in that previous world that we had when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, a handful of groups, made a decision about what made the news. And so while it is true that Facebook and Twitter have a lot of power to deplatform people, it's arguably a lot less power, frankly, than when the discourse was dictated completely by what 3 networks decided to put on the 10 o'clock news, right? So I'm not crazy about that as an argument, right? Another point, getting down to the end here, is that social media actually does not encourage new political participation. It only reinforces existing disparities. And this is from Ozer and Boulian in 2020. It's a regression analysis of multiple studies about the link between social media and political participation. And what it says is that contrary to common assumptions, our findings support a reinforcement effect, whereby those who are already politically active are motivated to use digital media, right? In other words, rather than recruiting new people to become politically involved, social media just makes the folks who are already politically involved more politically involved. This evidence in support of a durable reinforcement effect implies the potential for digital media to contribute to increased inequality in political participation over time, right? Now, what that basically means is that the people who are already involved tended to be older, they tended to be somewhat wealthier, right? That's what participation gaps look like, right, in political participation. And if social media is reinforcing that, then they're making those gaps worse. They're not recruiting like new, enthusiastic young people. They are making your mom and your dad and your grandparents more likely to get upset and go out and become involved in the political process, which only exacerbates existing gaps in political participation. participation, right? So this is both a good offensive point about how we're making those gaps worse, and also a good defensive response, I think, to the argument that you see, increased participation. So that's what I've got on the con. Again, a lot of content there. It's been a long video. What can you do, right? But it's a great topic. So hopefully some of that will register and resonate. But with that, since we're running short on time, let's move very quickly and do some final thoughts. Okay, so final thoughts, just really quickly. First of all, if you're going to NSDA Nationals, congratulations. I hate that you have to do it online, but that's been the reality for more than a year now for all of us. Hopefully next year we'll be getting back to a world where we're doing conventional debating again. I'm really excited about that. But regardless, it's a tremendous accomplishment. It was, when I was a kid, it was one of the highlights of my career. So I hope you do enjoy it, and I hope you do fantastic. Remember, though, it is an incredibly eclectic group of judges, so make sure you adapt. Advanced technical judges will never punish you, especially not at NSDA, for being a little bit more rhetorical and a little more accessible, so that you can make sure everybody in the room is following what you're doing. Remember that when you're on the pro, you really want to be the sort of voice of reason. Let's calm down here. Let's look at the long term. Overall, this has been a tool to increase, democratization and democracy in the United States. When you're on the con, you really want to talk about the crisis of the last 9 months, and you do have to kind of speak in those narrative terms while you balance that with having, your really good sources and your sound debate theory and things along those lines. So anyway, it's been a great year. As bad as it's been having to do it remotely, these have been some really good topics. We've heard from some of you guys over the course of the year that we've helped you, and we're really grateful for hearing about that. We're glad to do anything we can. For those of you who are graduating, congratulations. I hope this has been a great experience for you, like it was for all of us. And for those who are coming back, we will see you in August or in September. And with that, we will close with what we always say, which is the debate is for everybody. So remember, work hard, have fun, and hail state.